This week on Straight Talk Africa, the countdown to high-stakes elections in Nigeria. A record 93.4 million voters are gearing up to choose the country's next leader, amid mounting frustration over sky-high inflation, a cash shortage and worsening insecurity. Who and what will it take to turn things around? We'll have analysis here in Washington and reporting from Nigeria. Also, zero tolerance for coups. The African Union puts its foot down on power grabs as it focuses on armed conflict and free trade on the continent. We'll discuss the key takeaways from the recent AU summit in Ethiopia. Straight Talk Africa starts now. Hello there and welcome to Straight Talk Africa. We're coming to you from VOA's Washington headquarters. I'm Haydé Adams. Thank you so much for joining me. It's being called the largest democratic exercise on the African continent. Nigerians go to the polls on February 25th to pick a successor to President Muhammadu Buhari. 8 years ago, he came into office on a promise to fix the economy and provide better security. His presidency, however, has been marked by 2 recessions in the past 5 years, with Nigeria's currency, the naira, losing 1/3 of its value. Now there is a dire cash and fuel shortage. Security continues to be a problem, especially in the northeast, where armed groups are engaged in frequent killings and kidnappings. Well, this election cycle, 18 political candidates are vying for the presidency. Polls show only 3 have a realistic chance at winning the nation's highest office. A record 93.4 million people are eligible to vote, with a marked increase in young registered voters who see this election as a defining moment for their country. Well, let's go to Nigeria now. Timothy Obiezu is in the capital, Abuja, for us with more on the high-stakes vote.
Haiti, for the first time in more than 20 years, or what is known as Nigeria's Fourth Republic, election observers say it is too difficult to predict who becomes Nigeria's next president.
The polls are just days away and hotly contested, but not just between Nigeria's biggest political parties, the People's Democratic Party (PDP) and the incumbent All Progressives Congress (APC. There's a third contender. Peter Obi is riding a sweeping wave of momentum from millions of supporters who refer to themselves as the Obedient. The movement all started from online campaigns on social media, but experts say it is now challenging established political orders.
It sort of perhaps understands more the pain points for Nigerians, and he has spoken about this more for the longest. And Nigerians are resonating with what he's talking about.
But the PDP and APC boast they have more grassroots popularity. The PDP's Atiku Abubakar says he wants to unify the country and address insecurity and economic issues. 70-year-old Bola Ahmed Tinubu is a former Lagos State governor and the APC candidate. He says he wants to continue Buhari's legacies on insecurity, agriculture and infrastructural development. Nigeria is struggling to stem a wave of violence all over the country, but experts say there's more influencing the votes.
There's going to be a verdict on the APC administration. When the opposition, they took over power and have been in government for 8 years. They have touted some of their achievements in office. There are also a number of economic factors that are against them. High level of unemployment. They really dealt with security, and most recently the cash problem that Nigerians are facing. These are some of the things that will be on the minds of people as they go into the polls.
Nigeria is on the verge of a currency swap, but the transition from the old to new currencies has led to deadly protests that killed at least 3 people. Many here say there's a big task ahead, and that's why they want a president who's competent.
I think it's time for someone else that's fresh, that's different, that's new on the scene. We want to see something else. And I also want to say that we're not voting the man, we're voting the idea that we, the people, have the power to say we don't want this, but we want to choose something different instead.
But there's another thing. In Nigerian politics, there's an unwritten tradition that candidates must be either Christian or Muslim, or come from the north or south to achieve some sort of balance or national appeal. The APC flouted that rule. Tinubu, a southern Muslim, is running with another Muslim from the north. Olawale says that could have consequences.
If Bola Tinubu wins, it's also will be unprecedented because it perhaps will be the first time we'll have a Muslim ticket.
To emerge victorious, each candidate must win 25% of votes across 2/3 of Nigeria's 36 states and the capital, Abuja. For now, observers are waiting to see if come Saturday, a winner can actually emerge or if there will be a runoff. Timothy Obiezu for VOA News, Abuja, Nigeria.
Timothy, thank you. Well, earlier I spoke to Oge Onubogu. She is the new director of the Africa program at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars here in Washington. I asked her about the magnitude of this moment in Nigerian politics. I want to get your assessment of what you think will be the defining moments that we should look out for in this election in Nigeria.
Before I go into the answer that question directly on the Nigeria elections, I want to go back and mention the fact that there are several key elections that will be happening on the continent this year. It just so happens that the year will be opening up with Nigeria, which will really be the largest elections on the continent. So that is key, and that's important because it really sets the tone. It will help set the tone for the other elections that will come down the road this year. I think one of the things that we see going into these elections is that, unlike previous elections, these elections will be the 7th election since Nigeria's transition to civilian rule in 1999. And this will be the first election that will be conducted under the new Electoral Act that was just passed in February of 2022. So that's key because there's some new things within the Electoral Act that will inform how these elections are conducted. Apart from that, we've also seen the emergence of new political parties that have basically now expanded the space, where in the past the race had usually been between two major political parties. We now see the emergence of a third political party.
And that's a good thing, right?
And that is a good thing. That shows democratic development in Nigeria. That widens the pool and widens options for citizens. Apart from that, we also see an increase in youth participation as well. And if we go back to 2020, during the EndSARS protest, where young people in Nigeria were protesting police brutality, but as we look at the details around that protest, it went far beyond just protesting police brutality. I think it was also just a protest about wanting more from government, wanting more in terms of good governance. And we see that a lot of those sentiments translating as we move into these elections. When we look at voter registration and just data and information coming from Nigeria's Independent National Election Commission, we see the uptick in the number of registered voters, right, especially youth. And that's amazing to see that uptick coming from the 2019 elections, where there was low turnout, and a lot of people were actually talking about voter apathy in future elections. It's kind of amazing to see more young people now wanting change, but wanting change through the ballot box. That in itself it's a positive and something that should be noted. I think we also see an increase in the number of registered voters too as well. So as we look forward to these elections, I think everyone is paying very, very close attention. It's unclear. I think I've followed Nigerian elections since the transition. And with these elections coming up, it's really unclear. It's too close to call in many ways. And as we see the figures and we see the data, we may actually probably see a runoff with these elections. And in all of that, it is good. It shows a growth in Nigeria's democratic development.
Okay, I want to ask you about the legacy of President Muhammadu Buhari, the outgoing leader, of course, of Nigeria. After nearly a decade in power, he's confident that he has done a good job. What successes and what failures, in your view, will Nigerians remember him for?
Well, I think with President Muhammadu Buhari, over his last couple of years in office, I think we've seen an increase in insecurity. And not only insecurity confined to the northeastern part of the country, but across Nigeria. And in all of that too as well, in terms of governance, we have seen his administration with the passage of the Electoral Act, the new Electoral Act, and also with the passage of legislation to increase the space for young people to get involved in the political process. We've seen those positives. I think moving forward to these elections, a lot of citizens will be looking to his administration to ensure that the elections are seen as free, fair, and credible. I think at the end of the day, regardless of who wins the elections, Nigerians, and young Nigerians especially, will want to know and will want to feel that their votes actually counted. So in terms of legacy, I think that would be something memorable that could be left for Nigerians. And he himself has said it on several occasions. He's said it publicly at the UN that he wants that. A legacy of free, fair, and credible elections is a legacy that he wants to leave behind. So I think a lot of Nigerians are holding him to his word, and we will see what happens in the coming weeks.
All eyes on Africa's largest economy, Africa's most populous country, as that country heads to a very, very important and crucial election coming up. Oge, thank you so much for coming in to speak to us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks.
And that was Oge Onubogu, Director of the Africa Program at the Wilson Center, speaking to me here in Washington. Well, still ahead here on Straight Talk Africa, the African Union says it has zero tolerance for coups. And why was a top Israeli diplomat booted from its meetings in Addis Ababa? We'll talk about what came out of the recent AU summit in Ethiopia. Don't go away. We'll be back in a moment.
From around the world. Let's go.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Lino Khmoudou, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
Welcome back. African heads of state recently gathered for the annual African Union Summit at its headquarters in Ethiopia. The gathering came ahead of this week's one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a conflict that has affected economies everywhere and turned the spotlight on Africa's geopolitical importance. Top US, Russian and Chinese diplomats have toured the continent in recent months. Meanwhile, Russia's Wagner Group has become increasingly embroiled in conflicts in several African countries. The annual AU summit gave African leaders a chance to lay out their plans for tackling the continent's biggest challenges. And as VOA's Paul Ndio reports, armed conflict and trade topped the agenda.
Comorian President Azari Assoumani is the new chairman of the Africa Union. He replaces outgoing Senegalese President Macky Sall. In his acceptance speech, Assoumani emphasized the need to exert concerted efforts towards the betterment of Africa and its people. Leaders of the bloc met in Addis Ababa to discuss the many challenges facing the continent, including coups, conflict, and climate change. The AU is maintaining its suspension of 4 countries, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, and Sudan, that military leaders have ruled following coups. The African Union says it has zero tolerance for undemocratic change of power.
General sanctions should not be allowed to affect countries. We know perfectly well that economic and financial sanctions mainly affect the population, whereas those responsible often have the means to live better. Therefore, we should insist on targeted individual sanctions that can dissuade those who generally carry out coups and avoid general sanctions that could affect the people's interests.
The bloc's new chairperson says the leaders have agreed to accelerate the implementation of a fledgling trade deal launched in 2020. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is hailed as the biggest in the world. On a continent with 1.4 billion people, where Eritrea as the only holdout. Speaking at a press conference on the sidelines of the summit, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres announced that the Central Emergency Response Fund is set to release $250 million to drought-stricken Horn of Africa.
Around the world today, 339 million people are in need of humanitarian aid, an increase of more than 25% since last year. And so today, here in Addis, I'm announcing the largest ever allocation from our United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund, $250 million, to combat famine and to address unfunded emergencies.
Just before the summit ended, AU leaders resolved to strengthen the capacity of the East African Regional Force stationed in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Well, thank you for that reporting, Paul. Well, joining me now via Skype from New York is David Monder. He's a professor of political science at City University of New York. Professor, great to have you back with us on Straight Talk Africa. Always a pleasure to see you. Professor, I want to start at the beginning of the summit. An Israeli diplomat, Sharon Barley, ejected from the conference. Please help us understand why she was booted and what was a representative of Israel doing at the African Union summit in the first place?
Yes, so thank you for having me. So she was booted because the representatives at the AU said that she did not have the requisite accreditation papers. And it's important to understand Israel has been filing for observer status at the African Union, similar to what the Palestinian government has in the AU. So her booting actually is a really interesting sort of diplomatic occurrence, because there's been a lot of tension about the admission of Israel as an observer at the AU, given some of the dynamics in particular of what's happening with Israeli politics. Now we have a very right-wing government, in Israel. So essentially it was about Israel's observer status, but more so about the accreditation that the Israeli rep was booted out.
Now, of course, the Israelis have condemned this, and we'll get back a little later on to some of the ramifications and questions I have around that. But, Professor, one of the main themes to come out of the summit was zero tolerance for coups. We saw Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso and Sudan have all seen coups in recent years. And the AU essentially saying that, it needs to take another look at how it responds to undemocratic changes of power in these countries, that general sanctions might not be enough, maybe targeted sanctions. But what are the AU's alternatives here to really punish or bring in line these countries where they do see, these coups reoccurring?
So sanctions is one of the options, but as we know, measuring the effectiveness of sanctions is really problematic, all right? Because in particular in Africa, where borders are very porous, So really measuring their effectiveness is a challenge. And there's a limit to exactly how targeted sanctions on sanctions in general can work. The other alternative would be for a direct military intervention, like we saw with ECOWAS, led by Nigeria in Liberia. There's a space for foreign intervention, like we saw with the UK military intervening in Sierra Leone. But that, obviously, within the context of the AU, might not be particularly acceptable. I think there's an external diplomatic intervention which can happen within the framework of the AU, where regional sanctions on particular countries, for example, in the context of ECOWAS, on those three nations, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Mali. But by extension, because of ECOWAS sanctions on those three countries, the AU can have a unified position on sanctions. But that can also be carried to the United Nations Security Council, where the international community can isolate these particular states. But Haydé, I must say, ultimately, apart from the sanctions and options of military intervention, we really need to re-emphasize key issues of governance, within the continent, issues of governance, the rule of law, and democracy, because sanctions have limited effect, but ultimately within these countries affected by coup d'etats, governance and the rule of law and democracy would really be important in taking them forward outside of external intervention.
And Professor, does the greatest pressure tend to come from outside the continent, or is there really an opportunity here for the greatest pressure to see good governance and the rule of law upheld coming from inside the continent?
So I think it's both. And I think, unfortunately, with the context of the African Union, we have structural issues in terms of enforcing governance and the rule of law and democracy. I think you remember that even though Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea have been suspended, there's a lot of members of the AU who do not abide by good governance, democracy, and the rule of law, that manipulate constitutions to extend the power of presidents, that detain opponents and suppress the opposition. So internally, there's a problem. But also externally, we have challenges with non-state actors, groups like the Wagner Group, pushing the interests of major powers like Russia on the continent. We have economic issues with, the debt burden of, say, Chinese loans on the continent. And we also have direct intervention from external powers, more so in terms of the French legacy of interventionism on the continent. So it's a mixed bag. There's internal elements within the country that need to be looked at, but there's also other external factors. But ultimately, a lot of these issues will be solved with fixing the internal governance and also reinforcing this idea of the peer review, the African Union peer review mechanism, to really hold countries accountable and ensure that measures of democratic governance, measures of the rule of law, and economic issues within the country are upheld, rather than relying on the AU and external powers to sort out the problems within these individual countries.
Professor, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement was one of the issues discussed. This is, of course, the AU's flagship project under its Agenda 63, the Africa We Want. What does Africa want that isn't being realized in its efforts to take this from a pact to reality?
So this is a good question. I think one of the big issues here is the overlapping roles within the regional context. So, for example, when you look at the East African Community, COMESA, and SADC, there's a lot of overlap between states, their obligations, and it's not always clear, about the roles and some of the responsibilities in terms of reducing barriers to free trade. There needs to be a better integration with these regional economic communities so that you can actually have a feasible African continental free trade area. I think the other thing that needs to be looked at is the rules for commodities from outside the area, right? So how will members ensure that goods coming from Tanzania, for example, going into Zambia or to South Africa are actually from Tanzania, right? I think this has been another overlapping issue. But I think, Heidi, thirdly, the broader question is about reconciling the power of certain regional economic powers. And here we're particularly looking at South Africa, and ensuring that other smaller economies in the region feel that they are also benefiting from an economic union and are not being dominated by some of the larger regional economic powers, whether it's South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, or other powers within the framework. So there's a lot of structural issues that need to be looked at in terms of regional integration of the regional economic communities. There's broader issues of non-tariff barriers. How do you recognize, for example, working papers of a South African in Kenya or Kenyan in Equatorial Guinea? But there's also a broader framework of suspicion within, within Africa about how smaller economies are gonna survive, and not be dominated by some of the larger economic powerhouses within the continent.
Professor, we're up against the clock a little bit here, but I want to go back to the Israeli diplomat debacle and you talking about who the powerhouses are here on the continent. Israel says South Africa and Algeria are behind what we saw this weekend, and that these two countries are holding the AU hostage. Are there particular countries that are seen as powerhouses that do have outsized sway to influence decisions at the African Union, and is that a problem?
I think that's something to be looked at. I think that's a problem. But we also need to remember South Africa is a very close historical association with the Palestinian cause. During the apartheid era, there was a lot of interaction between the ANC and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Obviously, a lot of Arab countries, North African countries, Muslim countries are against Israel for what goes on and the treatment of the Palestinians. But I think Israel has made a very concerted diplomatic effort on the continent to try and reach out to countries on the continent. Recently, Chad opened up a mission in Israel. Sudan was looking to reestablish links with Israel. So the continent really needs to figure this out in terms of what will the common AU policy be towards Israel. But this will be particularly more difficult given the right-wing government that's come into power in Israel, and what we will continue to see, as the repression of the Palestinians and obviously the resultant reactions of the Palestinians to Israeli occupation.
Well, Professor, I wish we had more time to continue this discussion, but there is always a next time. Professor David Monder, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for always joining us here. Professor David Monder is from City University of New York, joining us there from that city via Skype.
Thank you.
And that is where we will leave it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. Do follow us on Facebook at Straight Talk Africa, and our Twitter handle, of course, is at VOA Straight Talk. Thank you to all our affiliates carrying the show throughout the African continent, and thanks to you, our audience, for always watching and always listening. I will see you next time. Until then, it's goodbye.